and welcome back to another episode of the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in and learn a little bit of Jewish history together. So in last week's session, we talked about the development of the rabbinic literature that we have, the different rabbinic writings, the writing down of the oral tradition of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and the form of the Midrashim, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, and we mentioned how the Babylonian Talmud is really the backbone of what we call rabbinic law, what we call the oral tradition, and the writing down of essentially everything that we know as Jews. Now, it's interesting that if we jump back to a section of the Talmud that we mentioned in our very first session, a year ago or whenever we started this series, we mentioned a very well-known section of the Talmud in Sanhedrin that discusses Jewish history and breaks it into three different time periods. The Talmud says that the Jewish history is a total of 6,000 years. Again, if you're following your Jewish calendar, we are in the year 5782. So if we line these two up, assuming that our calendar or our year tracking is 100% accurate, not so simple, but we're not going to delve into that now. But we are in the year 5782 of a potential 6,000 years of Jewish history. And the Talmud says the first 2,000 years of the 6,000 are tohu, null and void. Nothing happened. The second 2,000 are the 2,000 years of Torah. And the third 2,000 are the 2,000 years of the Messianic Era. So if we roughly break these up, we have the first 2,000 years, which went from creation until Abraham starts our religion. We have the second 2,000 years, which essentially goes from Abraham until the writing of the Mishnah. And then we have the third 2,000 years referred to as the Messianic Era, or the days of the Messiah, from roughly the organizing of the Mishnah up until modern times. Now, there's a couple interesting points just to look at with how history is played out vis-a-vis this section of the Talmud, that, it's pretty accurate to refer to the 2,000 years from Abraham until the sealing of the Mishnah as the time period of the development of the Torah. Because Avraham was the proto-Jew, was the beginning of the process of creating the Jewish people. That process went from Abraham until Moses, until the giving of the Torah on Sinai. And those 400 years, the Torah is created. The Torah is given to the Jewish people. Our national directive is passed down. And then essentially from Moshe until the Mishnah, we have a development and a study of the Torah of how we as Jews really deal with the Torah and learn the Torah and embrace the Torah and live the Torah. Now, what happens in these next 2,000 years that we're beginning tonight? So our sages say this is the 2,000 years of the Messianic Era, and essentially there's been many lost opportunities for the Messiah coming. Now, as we often remind ourselves, from a Jewish perspective, when we're talking about the Messiah, we are talking about the reinstitution of the Davidic monarchy in Israel, with the entirety of the Jewish people returning to Israel, and the sovereignty of Israel being recognized by by all of the nations of the world, including the United Nations, by the way, and UNESCO and all that stuff, right? They have to recognize Israel too and stop with all their anti-Israel resolutions for it to be the Messianic Era. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the Messianic Era. Now, to a certain extent, it makes sense that this time period would begin the time period of the days of the Messiah, the Messianic Era, however you want to explain it, because this is really the beginning of our long exile. So, of course, once our long exile begins, our desire and our focus is to end the exile and return to Israel. Right? So it sort of goes hand in hand that we're not calling it the 2,000 years of exile, but the 2,000 years of the Messianic Era. Okay, that's a little bit of a technical point, but practically it means that in this time period, we will see that redemption of the Jewish people returning to Israel, sovereignty, the Mashiach as king, and Torah law as supreme, etc., etc. Now, it's interesting to point out that during this time period is really the beginning, if you will, of the concept of false messiahs. we don't have really any false messiahs in Jewish history before this point. The first, really most famous false messiah is Jesus. The second famous false messiah, again, debate who really comes first, but I'm going based on their calendar, calling Jesus first. The second would be Bar Kokhba, who we discussed a couple sessions ago, and so forth and so on. Throughout this time period, we have numerous false messiahs. We're going to have Muhammad with Islam, which he's not considered a messiah necessarily to Islam, but again, similar concepts. And then we're going to go throughout history, and especially when we get to the 16th century and the 17th century, we're going to have major false messiahs like Shabtai Tzvi, Yaakov Frank, and then even in modern times, we have false messiahs who've, frankly done their damage to the Jewish world. In very modern times, we still have false messiahs. So both big and small. So it's interesting that we don't even have a concept of false messiahs until really we get to this last time period of Jewish history with Yashka, with Bar Kokhba, etc. Now, in part, you could say that's a technicality because you can't really have a false messiah till exile begins because the Jews are still in Israel, but that's not really true because the whole entirety of the Second Commonwealth that we covered in the past number of months, there was never a king, or never a legitimate king, never a king from the house of David, appointed by a prophet, etc., etc. We never had that during the Second Commonwealth. It was lacking the whole 420 years of the Second Commonwealth. So, you would think that the concept of false messiah could even start as early as the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, where you didn't have a king. But you didn't have that at any point during the Second Commonwealth until, again, if Jesus existed during the Second Commonwealth, not so simple, but then that would be the only one, and then Bar Kokhba right afterwards. So, and not only that, but it's interesting to point out that when we look at the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, the final book as we now have the 24 books of the Bible is a book by the name of Divrei Hayamim, or Chronicles, which is a very interesting book in many ways, shapes, or form. But what's really, one of the things that's fascinating about it is that in many ways mirrors what we call Nevi'im Rishonim, meaning the early books of the prophets. And by that we mean the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and the book of Samuel, and the book of Kings. Those four books. Those are called the early prophets. And it's always an interesting study to learn the two together. Learn the four books of the early prophets together with the book of Chronicles because of the overlap, chronologically for sure, total overlap, and then the similarities, the differences. In fact, if there's a wonderful edition put out by ArtScroll, it's kind of hard to get nowadays. It's put out, 20, 30 years ago. But in the back of the ArtScroll Chronicles is a 2-volume set. They really tackle all of the discrepancies between the book of Chronicles and the early prophets. But the question can be asked, if we already had the four books of the early prophets long before Chronicles was written, because the four books of the early prophets, the latest writer was Jeremiah, but they're written from Joshua to Jeremiah. And we have Chronicles, which is written by Ezra, the last of the prophets. Why did Ezra need to, so to speak, at least from a historical perspective, rewrite the books of the early prophets? And the answer is that Ezra, in writing Chronicles, which only focuses, by the way, on the house of Judah after the kingdom splits, but the reason is because that was essentially the platform of the house of David to become king in Israel again. Because when Ezra goes back to build the Second Commonwealth, his goal is to build the Commonwealth with a king from the house of David. So he writes the book of Chronicles really as the political platform, if you will, the website, right? It was stating the legitimacy of the house of David, and the heir apparent at that time was Zerubbabel, and that was the purpose of the book, to show that this is the trajectory of this family, starting with Judah, down through his family, down to David, on through the kings of Judah, and through the destruction of the Babylonian exile, and then Zerubbabel bringing that family torch back to Israel to hopefully take the throne. Didn't happen, but that's why Ezra wrote the book. A bigger question is, why did at the time of canonization, why was that included in the canon? Okay, different discussion for different time. But it's fascinating to point out that was the point of the book, to show that even though during the whole Second Commonwealth there's no legitimate king, it was definitely the goal, very clearly the goal of Ezra, and because of first the rule of the Persians, then the rule of the Greeks, and even when we had freedom from the Greeks, when we had our own sovereignty from the Greeks, and we weren't under the control of the Greeks anymore, well, then we had the problem with the Maccabees taking the control, even though they weren't supposed to. And we discussed how problematic that was. And then that leads to Herod and the Romans, and that's the end of everything. So we shouldn't think for a moment that the concept of king wasn't a present concept in the whole Second Commonwealth. It was very much a present concept. It was just never able to be achieved because, for the most part, the country was always a vassal state to a larger empire. Now, when we enter our full exile, we have this concept of the Messianic Era, and we see people with Messianic pretension, sometimes legitimate like Bar Kokhba, but usually not legitimate like Jesus and Shabtai Tzvi and others, more modern times, and everyone in between. It's all false messiahs, but the concept can only exist when we get to this stage of our sages, the last stage of Jewish history, when it's time for the Messiah to come. It's time for it all to happen. And God willing, it'll happen speedily in our days. Okay. After the completion of the Mishnah and the solid rule of Marcus Aurelius, which we talked about last time, and the benevolence between Marcus Aurelius and Yehuda Anasi, after this point, Rome goes into literally a tornado. There's always a sign of an unstable organization or government is the constant turmoil and turnover of leadership. First of all, the lack of succession of leadership, and even more so, which was more common in antiquity, is the constant overthrowing of leadership. And over the next 100 years or so, we see that happen constantly in the Roman Empire. In the 3rd century, we see that there are Roman empires. There's the year of the 5 emperors, the year of the 8 emperors. There's emperors who serve for a week, emperors who serve for a month, a couple months. It's just a crazy time period that shows that the Roman Empire is really starting to crumble. The Roman Empire is starting to decline, and one of the number one signs of it is the lack of leadership, lack of successful leadership, and this leads to all kinds of problems within the Roman Empire. First of all, there's a lot of corruption. That's really the cause of a lot of this. There's so much infighting and civil wars between different factions of the government, it's interesting. I always like to quote the famous George Santayana quote of those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And, this is a story we've said so many times. First of all, and talking about the Jewish commonwealths, right? The first commonwealth, the second commonwealth, and even the decline of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, what were the signs of decline? It was this. It was lack of leadership. It was leaders being overthrown every 5 minutes and new leaders trying to step in and being overthrown again in civil war. That was the decline of the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, now with the decline of the second commonwealth, and we see that's what happens in Rome. And again, I don't know how you could stop it if you're in the throes of that, but if you wanted to save an empire, and you saw with all the civil wars, infighting, lack of leadership, it's like, oh, we got to get leaders in here to really save the empire. But okay, you can't just snap your fingers and make leaders appear, but that's a big sign of a declining empire. Now, something else that's very interesting that happens at this point is in the year 284, there's a Roman emperor who actually rules for a certain amount of time, has a certain amount of success, by the name of Diocletian, and he sees as one of the biggest problems of the declining Roman Empire is the sheer size of the empire. And we're going to put some maps up here on the screen now so you can sort of see Rome at its height, and we're going to then transition to see Rome as it was starting to decline, and then we'll end up with the map of the world today so you know where we're talking about in the world. And we'll also, by the way, put a link to this on the website, torahcleveland.com/destiny. And what Diocletian's idea was the empire was just too big to rule from Rome, from the old boot that became even modern day Italy and Rome. It was just too big, too vast of an empire. And even though Rome had a pretty interesting setup of leadership with local governors and we talked about this a lot and different layers of leadership, the decision that Diocletian made is that the empire should be split into two. and just have two emperors, and through that, it'd be a smaller pill to swallow, so to speak, and hopefully stabilize the empire. So now, this is something he sets into motion, and over the course of the next 100 years or so, to the year 395, Rome will split, it'll unite, it'll split into two empires, three empires, go back and forth, but eventually, by the year 395, it's going to be complete. And by the way, that's all those, we see a lot of those splits in those maps that we put on the screen. But by the time we come to the year 395, it'll be firmly split into two empires, one based in Rome and known as the Western Empire, and one based in the city of Byzantium, known as the Eastern Empire or the Byzantine Empire, and this is when it starts. It essentially starts in 284, and it's going to be a century process to solidify the splitting of the Roman Empire. And we'll see, the ramifications that has on the world, and more specifically on the Jews. So even though it was a plan to try to solidify the empire, in the end, it really just helped to perpetuate the decline of the empire. Because what's going to happen is that the western part of the empire in modern day Western Europe, but based in Rome, that is going to really, by the 5th century, is going to be gone, because we're going to see that it's going to be attacked from these Germanic barbarians, the Visigoths, the Huns, the Franks, the Vandals, and that's going to bring that empire very quickly to an end. And even though we're going to eventually talk about the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman. Okay, you want to call it an empire, fine, but it wasn't holy or Roman, that's for sure. And it's going to be a much smaller chunk of territory, and we'll get to that in coming sessions. But what becomes the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, that's going to be a force to reckon with for another 1,000 years. Really until we're going to see the rise of Islam, and eventually Islam will take over the Byzantine Empire, but that's going to be a pretty solid part of the empire for a long, long time to come. Now, within the Roman Empire at this time, Christianity was still not that much of a force to be reckoned with. It had gained some traction, but for the most part, it was still small, marginalized, heavily oppressed by the Romans and by the Jews. By the way, it wasn't just the Romans, we participated in that. And therefore, it was still somewhat of an underground startup revolutionary movement. But we have to remember the background that we've been talking about leading up to this. And that is that for the most part within the Roman Empire at this point, which itself is crumbling, paganism was bankrupt. The average Roman did not see a true value in the religion of the empire anymore, or the paganistic culture, or the paganistic practices, or any of that. It was basically looked at as bankrupt, for sure by the scholars, and by much of the kingdom. So there was already sort of a ripe, fertile ground for the rise of monotheism throughout the empire. As we mentioned many times before, we saw that there are large numbers of converts to Judaism at this time, but it proves to be much easier to convert to Christianity than to convert to Judaism. At this time, it appears that there had already been a pretty firm break from Judaism, at least in as much as people who converted to Christianity from a non-Jewish religion did not have to follow circumcision, or did not have to eat kosher or follow Jewish law. And probably by this point, it had already, even those of Jewish descent who were involved in Christianity had already abandoned anything remotely relating to Jewish tradition or Jewish practice. Now, within the Roman Empire, the two groups that become most attracted to Christianity are the intellectuals, because, as we said, they saw paganism as bankrupt. They felt the idea of monotheism was much more intellectually stimulating. Probably there's some of the interplay between Judaism and the Roman Empire, as we've mentioned, through all the conversions, through the back and forth, probably at the time of Marcus Aurelius, and the intellectuals were sparked by the ideas of monotheism. So we see that Christianity starts to take hold within the Roman Empire in intellectual circles. It also takes root amongst the lower class, because the lower class regularly feels disenfranchised by the government, disenfranchised by the leadership, by the rulers, and therefore Christianity was looked at as the revolution. So we see sort of these two different opposite opposing groups within the Roman Empire, where Christianity really does start to pick up some steam, start to get some numbers, but ultimately the watershed moment for Christianity in the world, and if it wouldn't have been for this moment, who knows if the world would have ever become Christian, or the part of the world that became Christian, who knows if it would ever become Christian, and that is, in the year 306, the Emperor Constantine the Great, as he is called, really puts an end to a lot of the tumultuous leadership issues that Rome had been having, and he himself is going to be the Roman emperor for almost 30 years. And so as he takes rule, consolidates the empire, the rulership and leadership once again, brings it back into one empire as opposed to two separate empires. We see that the Roman Empire has, we could call it a calm before the storm, before its ultimate destruction, or at least another high point in the time of the Roman Empire. But besides Constantine being a great emperor for the Romans, there's something else that happens on his watch. Probably somewhere around the year 310 or so, his mother, Helena, becomes Christian. She converts to Christianity initially in private because it was still considered punishable by law in Rome to become Christian. It was an illegal religion still within the empire. But here you have the mother of the emperor who converts to Christianity. Whether her son knew about it at first or ends up finding out about it is unclear, but definitely at some point the influence of Helena goes on to her son Constantine, and the watershed moment for Constantine himself comes in the form, as it's recorded, of a dream. The dream has different accounts based on where you're looking, but basically what happens in this dream is before one of his major battles, Jesus and possibly Jesus' mother, Mary, come to him and say that if he takes on Christianity and makes the empire Christian, he will be successful in all of his endeavors. And Constantine, in his dream, makes a deal with Jesus, saying that if I'm successful in the battle tomorrow, I'm all with you, all with my mother, right? I'm all in, so to speak. And as the story goes, sure enough, Constantine was successful in battle. Therefore, thereafter, he converts to Christianity, again, initially in secret, but eventually comes out. And the way things work in antiquity is if the emperor is, and especially an emperor had firm control of his empire like Constantine, if an emperor changes religions, the whole empire changes religions. We're going to see this a few times in these next few hundred years we're going to discuss. The famous Khazars, the Khazars. So Kazakhstan had an uprising today, so we have to mention the Khazars over here. So the Khazars is going to be very similar. The king of the Khazars is going to convert to Judaism, and the country will become Jewish. So over here, Constantine converts to Christianity, making the Roman Empire, which was at a strong point, at least the last strong point it would know, makes the whole empire a Christian empire, and therefore with that the whole world becomes Christian, and or most of the known world, most of the civilized world, so to speak, becomes Christian. And this is really the watershed moment for Christianity. It's what made Christianity a world religion, a force to reckon with on the map of the world. And for us specifically, what it does is Rome always represents to us Esav. The constant struggle we have with our uncle Esav, with our cousin Esav, is embodied in Rome, because we understand that Rome, the Roman Empire, descended from Esav, and therefore even one of Esav's names is Edom in the Torah, and the Hebrew name for Rome is Edom. So it's one and the same there, but we look at it as Esav's empire is Rome. Now, when Rome becomes Christian, and from this point forward, roughly the year 337 on, 350 on, we're going to associate Esav and Christianity. Because if Rome becomes Christian, Christianity and Rome become one and the same, so too Esav becomes part of that. So from this point on in history, when we're watching, so to speak, the footprint of Esav throughout history, it can now be seen in the wake of the church. Beyond making the whole entire empire Roman, Constantine does a lot to try and consolidate the religion, because until this point, since the religion was so small and just trying to gain footing, but also had its internal dispute, so to speak, as what they believed, as they've firmly broken away from Judaism. They did not follow the Torah at all, and he convenes the first Council of Nicaea, which is the first attempt of really organizing the Christian religion, deciding what they believe, what they don't believe, and that happens in the town of Nicaea under Constantine's watch. Now, in Christian folklore, theology, possibly history, they mention a Council of Jerusalem, which supposedly happened in the year 50, which a lot of the early decisions of Christianity were supposedly made. The historicity of that is often questionable, but even if that did happen, there was nothing between the year 50 and 350 to add any organization, structure, unified plan for Christianity. But it's in 350, it's in the Council of Nicaea in roughly the year, probably 320 or so, under the watch of Constantine, where we see that the Christianity really starts to take a definition, starts to take hold, and has some, so to speak, organization as a religion. By the way, let me just give you the accurate year there for the First Council of Nicaea as it's recorded. It is recorded to have happened in the year 325. 325 of the Common Era. So that would put it definitely towards roughly the middle of Constantine's rule, definitely the middle of the time that he became Christian. Okay, another thing that we see happen under Constantine's rule is the landscape of the relationship of the Jews, the relationship of the country which is now called Palestine by the Romans. We still call it Israel. We always call it Israel. We never stop calling it Israel or Judea. The place of that country or that part of the Roman Empire is going to tremendously change within the Roman Empire, because from really the destruction of the temple, you have to remember we had a couple revolts. The Bar Kokhba revolt at this point was 200 years before this. But really from the 200 years of Bar Kokhba until this point, Palestine/Judea/Israel is just a backwater part of the empire. It's tried to, everything we discussed until now, the Romans tried to keep it at bay with the Jewish observance, Jewish practice. You had a few Christians there, and that's about all it was. Now, what's going to happen is because Rome is now Christian, Palestine is going to become a much more significant city, and really the turning of, or I should say Jerusalem is going to become a more significant city, because that's where they say, a lot of the big stuff happened with Jesus. And we're going to see that Jerusalem is going to be turned now, for the first time really, into a holy city for the Christians. So Jerusalem becomes a holy city for us at the time of Abraham, more specifically at the time of David, King David. It becomes a holy city for the Christians somewhere around the year 330, and we're going to see it become holy for the Muslims in about the year 700. But what happens is Constantine's mother has a pilgrimage to Jerusalem where she supposedly finds 3 buried crosses, and to mark 3 different spots where Jesus was crucified, and so forth and so on. And there's many churches built after her crusade. One is the famous Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which according to the Christian religion is the place where Jesus was buried. That's just off the Temple Mount in today's Old City. It's what's called the Christian quarter, but with the Old City of Jerusalem today, you have the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the Jewish quarter. But really, practically, it's the Jewish quarter and the Muslim quarter and the Muslim quarter and the Muslim quarter as far as the residents and inhabitants. But if that area, if you ever take the tunnel tours and we come out of the tunnels, there's a street there called the Via Dolorosa, and that's right near a lot of the Christian sites and right near where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. That's built by Helena, commissioned by Constantine, and also the Church of the Nativity and Bethlehem, and we see many churches and monasteries now just spring up within Jerusalem, Palestine. This is the first time really Israel, Jerusalem become a spot on the Christian map, commissioned by Helena and by Constantine. Now, one of the other things that happens, which I guess is a good thing, is if you recall, we talked about the temple that was built on top of the Temple Mount, the temple to the Roman pagan god Jupiter. If you recall, Jerusalem's called Alea Capitolina, referring to the fact that it was now a city dedicated to Jupiter. So Constantine has the temple destroyed. Not our temple, that was long destroyed, but the temple that was on the Temple Mount destroyed, and now the temple of Jupiter is gone somewhere around the year 320, 330. Now, there is a church known as the New Church, the Night Church, which it's unclear exactly where it was. Some historians and archaeologists speculate that it was actually on the Temple Mount, built over this temple to Jupiter. Some people say it was built just off the Temple Mount. Some people say it was connecting from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to the Temple Mount. But there was definitely another very large church that existed that's not there today, that we have some ruins of, that might very well have been built on top of the Temple Mount. And therefore, according to this theory, when Constantine destroys the temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount, this Christian church will be built there, and it will last until an earthquake and maybe until the Muslims somewhere later on in history. And we're going to see there will be attempts of the Christians to actually build a Christian church on top of the Temple Mount. If it wasn't built at this time, it was built later. And according to some, the Dome of the Rock is initially built as a Christian church. And it's only later, with the rise of Islam, when Jerusalem is conquered by Caliph Omar, when that church is transitioned to the Dome of the Rock and the Muslim shrine that is today. But we'll get to that in a later session, in the next session, or 2 sessions from tonight. So what happens at this point is a couple different things. First of all, as Constantine takes his religion and makes the empire Roman, the city of Rome at this point it's the writing's on the wall. It's no longer really the central place in the empire, and therefore he switches the main center of leadership within the Roman Empire, which, as we mentioned before, is consolidated this time into one empire, to a city that before this point was known as Byzantium. And when the empire had split into two, Byzantium became the seat of the other empire, the Eastern Empire. Byzantium is in modern-day Turkey. We now call it Istanbul. Constantine, man known for his modesty, changes the name of the city from Byzantium to Constantinople, named after himself, Constantine, and makes it the capital city of the Roman Empire, makes it a beautiful, thriving metropolis with not sparing any expense. And that's really, and Byzantium in many ways, even before this point, was a great city, but he makes it an absolutely fabulous city, and it'll be the seat of right now the consolidated Roman Empire, but the Eastern Roman Empire, which will be the longer living part of the Roman Empire, that'll be the capital of it for years to come. And eventually, when the Muslims come and take over this part of the Roman Empire, and it'll eventually become the Empire of Suleiman the Magnificent and the Ottoman Empire, the center will be Constantinople. They'll change the name to Istanbul, which, if you like the musicians They Might Be Giants, you know that song Istanbul and a Constantinople. Now it's Istanbul and a Constantinople. It's making fun of this point because a lot of the Western world, especially the Christian world, until this very day refers to the city as Constantinople, but for sure in the Muslim world it is referred to as Istanbul. And that's where he makes the center of his leadership. And that's what Constantine does, essentially irrevocably changing the world forever, making Christianity a force to be reckoned with. And we're going to see that what will happen after Constantine, when his descendants take over, that the governor in charge of Jerusalem in the year 351, not about 15 years or so after Constantine passes away, will be someone by the name of Constantius Gallus, and he will report a revolt of the Jews that never actually happened, but he reports it back to Byzantium or Constantinople to say that the Jews are once again rebelling, and in Roman records it's often recorded as the 3rd Jewish revolt or the 4th Jewish revolt. Never happened. Not recorded in Jewish sources at all as ever having happened. But he uses this as a pretense to put a set of fierce anti-Jewish laws into place in the land of Israel, shutting down all the academies that are left, killing thousands of Jews, and this essentially is the end of the line for the Jewish community in Israel. So, as we mentioned, from the destruction of the temple to Bar Kokhba, Jews are still throughout the country, and there's all the revolts. After Bar Kokhba, the Jewish presence is really only in the north, from the year 150 until now 350 for those 200 years. Now we see the Jewish presence essentially stomped out in Israel, and from this point, really until after the Spanish expulsion in 1492, we're not going to talk a lot about Israel. We'll talk a little bit about it in the 13th century, but there's not going to be much of a Jewish presence through the Dark Ages in the land of Israel. Now, this has many ramifications. First of which, we mentioned last week that the Jerusalem Talmud is an incomplete work. And this is the end of it, right? We look at the end date of the Jerusalem Talmud as the year 350 because they couldn't continue. They weren't in Jerusalem anymore. From this point on, who's ever left in the rabbinic leadership now goes to Babylon to be part of the Babylonian scholarship and contribute to the Babylonian Talmud, which will have another 100 years or so before it is completed. So this is the incomplete nature of the Jerusalem Talmud becomes solidified at this time, the year 351. That's one of the first ramifications of what happens. The other one's quite interesting, and that is that as Jews, really, this week's parsha actually is very apropos we're discussing this, but as Jews, the very first mitzvah we're given in Egypt is the mitzvah, in this week's parsha, of HaChodesh Hazeh Lechem Rosh Chodashim, the mitzvah to keep a Jewish calendar with Rosh Chodesh, proclaim the new moon, make it a minor holiday. That's the very first commandment we were given while we were still slaves in Egypt. We're not slaves, but still enslaved in Egypt before we were emancipated. Now, the way that this commandment works of sanctifying the moon to keep the calendar is that two witnesses have to witness the new moon and have to be accepted by the Sanhedrin as kosher witnesses, as having truly seen the moon. And then the Sanhedrin, the high court, proclaims the new moon in Jerusalem, and therefore that becomes the first day of the month. Messengers are sent out, and that is the first day of the month. That's a summary of Tractate Rosh Hashanah, where it discusses how we proclaim Rosh Chodesh. But now we have a problem, because now there's no Sanhedrin in Israel anymore. There's no real presence of Jews in Israel. So the question is, how are we going to keep Jewish calendars? And we know we have them. Hey, if you've ever been to a Jewish butcher shop, you know you have the Jewish calendars. And it wasn't a creation of the Jewish butchers or the Jewish monument makers. It was something that was dealt with at this time. So with the complete exile of the Jews into the Babylonian Empire, we have the Nasi, who used to be the religious leader in Israel, now is in exile with the rest of everyone else in Babylon. But the descendant from the house of Hillel, the house of David, is now someone who is known to us as Hillel HaKatan, the small Hillel, or Hillel II. But his tremendous contribution to the Jewish people is that he gives us our calendar as we know it. Because the calendar until this point, until roughly the year 350 of the Common Era, is fluid. There was no set calendar. It could change every year and every month, because the Sanhedrin was given a lot of wiggle room, if you will, within the system between Rosh Chodesh could have always been one of 2 days, and there's different ways that legally the Sanhedrin could manipulate that based on the witnesses. And then we also had the concept of the leap year. This year right now is a leap year, but that was not predetermined. That was always determined by the Sanhedrin when they felt it was necessary. Hillel II comes up with our calendar system as we have it until this very day. It's a 19-year system in which already figures how long each and every single one of the months are going to be. Some will be 29 days, some will be 30 days, and how many leap years there will be. And that number is that there are 11 leap years within the there are 7 leap years within the 19-year cycle. Sometimes separated by every 3 years, sometimes every 2 years, and they're spaced out. And so, because our calendar, the Jewish calendar, is a lunar soli calendar, a soli lunar calendar, meaning that it's a lunar calendar that has to correct for the solar calendar. Because our holidays, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuos, our pilgrimage holidays, have to happen in certain seasons of the year. Pesach has to happen in the spring. Sukkot has to happen in the fall. So therefore, we have to make sure to always adjust the lunar calendar, which is 11 days shorter than the solar calendar, to keep it in the right seasons. So therefore, we have to add in a leap year every 2 to 3 years to make that adjustment. They used to be determined whether it's 2 years or 3 years by the Sanhedrin. Hillel HaKatan determines it with his system. And he makes a mathematical equation that from this point on in Jewish history, the calendar could always be figured out. And we're going to see with unanimity, pretty much from this point, there's going to be a hiccup at the time of Sa'ad Dagon that we'll discuss. But for the most part, the Jews, based on the equations and the mathematical work that Hillel II does at this time, we're going to still have our calendars today. It was a work of mathematical feats that mathematicians until this day are still very impressed with, because there's a number of besides just the details I've told you, there's a number of other details worked out in there consistently. For example, Yom Kippur never falls on a Friday or a Shabbos. right? I'm sorry, never falls on a Friday or a Sunday. It can fall on Shabbos, never falls on a Friday or a Sunday. Never. And because it would have been very hard to go straight from Yom Kippur to Shabbos or Shabbos to Yom Kippur. So the calendar was orchestrated never to do that. And the 10th of Teves, which we just had, was orchestrated into the calendar to never fall on Shabbos. It can fall on Friday, but can never fall on Shabbos. One of the reasons for that is because if it was to fall on Shabbos, we would have to fast it even on Shabbos. This is one of the reasons why we fast it on a Friday. It's the only fast we put on Friday. Anyhow, all that's worked into his equation, and it's been spot on, and the time of it has been spot on, that a 19-year cycle with 7 leap years built in will consistently keep a lunar calendar on track with the solar calendar, giving us our calendars we have today and a system for the butchers to base the calendars that they make on. So that was the great contribution of Hillel II, making our calendar that we have today. Now, the halachic question that pops up on this is based on what's in this week's parsha with the discussion Rosh Chodesh. It's clear that it says, HaChodesh is Elechem Rosh Chodeshim. This is given over to you. You have to proclaim the month in Jerusalem in front of the Sanhedrin. So we understand that Hillel II gave a great mathematical equation to make this happen, but religiously, so to speak, how did it happen? You don't have a Sanhedrin in Jerusalem anymore. So there's 2 halachic opinions stated as to the validity from a halachic perspective of this calendar. Number one is that when Hillel II made his calendar system, he preemptively sanctified all of the Rosh Chodeshes until the Beis HaMikdash can be rebuilt, until the Sanhedrin can be reconstituted. He did something to just sanctify them all for the future. Okay, that's questionable if you could do such a thing. Maimonides says something completely different. Maimonides, the Rambam, says that there's a concept that, well, yes, there's no Sanhedrin, but if there's at least a minion of Jews in Israel that recognize this day as Rosh Chodesh, that's enough for the Jewish people to proclaim this as Rosh Chodesh. And the Rambam writes that even from this terrible time period of 351 on until Jews start going back to Israel slowly in the 13th century and more dramatically in the 15th and 16th century, there was always at least 10 Jews living in Israel who were using this calendar of Hillel II, and since those 10 Jews in Israel were proclaiming Rosh Chodesh on the day based on the calendars that we have today, that was enough to look at it as sanctified by the Jewish people. And this is why, if you noticed this past Shabbos, if you're in Shul, when we did Shabbos Mevorchim, Kiddush HaChodesh, bench the new moon, we say very interesting words at the end of the blessing. We reference the Chaverim Kol Yisrael. What was this talking about? According to Maimonides, or that's really probably an insertion, according to Maimonides' position, those friends of Israel mentioned in the sanctification of the moon are the friends of Israel, of all of us living in Israel from this point up until today, that recognize Rosh Chodesh based on this system, therefore legitimizing religiously the system. Okay. One last detail for tonight is that the very last non-Roman emperor is somebody by the name of Julian Apostate, who comes in the year 361. He is a descendant of Constantine, but for whatever reason, himself does not believe in Christianity, and we see that he, and really this happens a little bit even between Constantine and Julian the Apostate. They're separated by a few emperors. There is some back and forth and waxing and waning with Christianity, but Julian the Apostate is really going to be the last of the Roman emperors who's going to be firmly non-Christian, hence his name, Julian the Apostate, and he's going to be very favorable to the Jews. In fact, he's going to give permission for the Jews to go back to Israel and even to start rebuilding the temple, of which we have some archaeological evidence today. But the unfortunate fact of history is that Julian the Apostate only rules before 2 years before he is knocked off, and he's mortally wounded during a campaign against the Persians, and that's going to be the last bastion of hope of Rome becoming non-Christian. And from that point on, Rome is firmly Christian. And the coming days, we'll talk about everything comes along with that. But as we mentioned before, when the Christians were a small group, a small marginalized group, they were persecuted not only by the Romans, but by the Jews. We participate in that persecution. And that's not going to be forgotten on these Christians at this point. And we're going to see from this point forward, this is really going to be the rise of anti-Semitism as we know it, persecution of Jews as we know it. Up until this point in history, anytime Jews were persecuted, it wasn't necessarily because of our religion, it was because of our nationality. It was nationalistic struggles that led to our persecution. Wars, conquests, attempted conquests of us. That was the only time we see death of Jews until this point. But this is going to be the first time now that we're a nation in exile and don't have a land, there is no land to conquer anymore. We're going to see that the persecution of Jews unfortunately doesn't stop, but now from this point forward and until modern times, it's going to be done not in the name of nationalism as it was before, but in the name of religion. And that is what we'll talk about, unfortunately, quite often in the coming sessions ahead. I thank you all for coming, and I thank you for listening.